Whether you're preparing for A-levels or taking your A-levels right now, this man, Edgar Allan Poe, can help you score higher on the Paper 3 language analysis question. Let me tell you why and how you can make best use of his work. First of all, Poe lived during the early 1800s. He's an early 19th century to mid-19th century writer, and his work is well regarded, and so it sort of serves as a great example of the writing of the time. Now, this is an interesting period because it's this transition from early modern English to late modern English, and you're very likely to get a text from this time period. Poe's writing is super interesting, and by getting used to it, you're kind of immersing yourself in the writing of the time so that when you see that text on the exam, it's not a surprise to you, and you're not spending a lot of time decoding and figuring out the meaning of what the author is saying. It'll come to you because you're used to the style of writing. Poe writes in a lot of different forms, from short stories, novellas, poems, letters, articles, so there's so much to choose from. Which brings us to our second point, and that is his work is short. So much of what he has written is something that can be read in a single sitting. So unlike a lot of other works which tend to be thick reads, Poe, you can sit down and get a real good feel from start to finish just based on 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. And the final reason why Poe is such a great choice for familiarizing yourself with the text of the time is that there is a lot of material out there to help you understand his writing and his style. And there are bonus reasons as well. For instance, Poe's just a good writer, and also he helped shape the horror and psychological thriller genres that we still love today. In addition to that, his work is free. He published almost 200 years ago, which means all of his work is now in the public domain. You can find it online and access it all for free from the comfort of your computer. You can use your time reading Poe to actually kind of turn that into a study, not just a way to enjoy the reading and get used to it, but also to pre-examine this type of text and see what type of differences there are between the way people wrote in Poe's time in the early 19th century to mid-19th century, and the way people write now, the stuff that you're familiar with. I suggest that as you read, you single out some passages that seem interesting for their stylistic elements, and then periodically pause and investigate those passages and see what is different between how they were writing at the time and how we write today. That sort of investigation will stick with you a lot better than sitting in a classroom and having someone tell you a list of differences and you hope that you find one on the exam. By investigating yourself, you're going to get a much better understanding because it will be relevant to you in the text that you are reading. Let's investigate two samples of Poe's writing to see what we can learn from. The first comes from a letter to Sarah Whitman, whom he refers to as Helen, and the second is from one of Poe's short stories called The Gold Bug. The letter to Helen is quite passionate. It's kind of a love letter, but really is more of a letter of desperation. In this short passage, he writes, "Oh God, how I curse the impotence of the pen, the inexorable distance between us. I am pining to speak to you, Helen, to you in person, to be near you while I speak, gently to press your hand in mine, to look into your soul through your eyes, and thus be sure that my voice passes into your heart." There's plenty to look at there. The first thing that stands out as unique to me is the syntax, the way the sentences are written. They're longer, more sort of complicated than writing is a lot of times today. Also, I noticed that Poe uses dashes a lot to interject or link together thoughts and details. Poe also is clearly not afraid to use advanced vocabulary in his writing. Impotence and inexorable are fairly high-level words, and pining is becoming a bit archaic now. A quick Google search shows us that it means to miss or long for, and those are the terms that we would probably use today. A quick glance at the engram shows us that after Poe's time, the term did have a pretty significant decrease in usage. One final interesting observation that I noticed is how Poe says, "gently to press your hand in mine," whereas now we would say, "to gently press your hand in mine." If you take a moment to figure out what is actually going on here, you'll probably notice that nowadays we put the adverb between the to and the verb. If you search this online and do some research, you might notice that that's called a split infinitive. At one point, that was a no-no, but nowadays it's common usage. So you can see how doing a little bit of investigating can lead you to some very useful knowledge. Now we move on to Poe's short story called The Gold Bug. A passage that stood out to me is actually quite brief, and it's where the narrator is describing his sense of shock at a startling coincidence. The passage reads, "I say the singularity of this coincidence absolutely stupefied me for a time. This is the usual effect of such coincidences. The mind struggles to establish a connection, a sequence of cause and effect, and, being unable to do so, suffers a species of temporary paralysis." Analyzing this sample, I immediately realized that, just like with the last example, Poe doesn't hesitate to use an advanced vocabulary, such as the word stupefy, and several of the words he uses, their meanings have changed a little bit over time. For instance, singularity, which Poe uses to mean highly unique. However, recently the term has become much more associated with a technological singularity, or a singularity as it occurs in physics. Another thing that stands out to me in this passage is something that also stood out to me in the last passage, and that is Poe's use of longer, idea-rich sentences with complicated constructions. Information is added in the sentence through the use of dashes and commas to a degree that most current text probably wouldn't use. By making it a practice to identify interesting passages and then go back and pay close attention to them, you'll start noticing patterns in the writing, and that is something then you can use as a template for new texts that you're presented with in the future. Now, you don't only have to read Poe. Any author of the time period, any contemporary will work as well. I like Poe because his stuff is short, but you can't go wrong with Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. Whatever your liking is, if you can find an author from that time period and really dig into their works and investigate the way that they write, it can do nothing but improve your studies of language and how it changes over time.